Welcome to the Winged Wheel Podcast, the number one source for news, analysis, and discussion on the Detroit Red Wings, the NHL, and all things hockey. Here are your hosts, Ryan Hanna, Brad Crisco, and Evan Lopsinger.
So a little bit of a fun story to bring us into today's remote episode of the Winged Wheel Podcast. And yes, it's remote, but it's for good reason because we have Max Bultman of the Athletic Detroit back on the show for the Good in the Room version of the Winged Wheel Podcast. So I was trying to plan with Max as to what episode this month he would be on. And it was going to be something like 2 weeks ago. And the timing just didn't work out. And Max was like, "Oh, I'm really sorry, man." I was like, "Oh, dude, don't worry. What's going to happen? It's like the Red Wings are going to be in the same place post-holiday break and nothing will have changed. We'll have the same kind of December doldrums to talk about." And I just remember that right now opening this episode. I am so happy we ran out the clock because imagine you had been on the episode right before the coaching change.
Why? Did something happen?
Yeah, Yzerman got sassy in an interview. That's pretty much all that happened.
That did happen. It's been an eventful week. And I don't think, to your point, if we had done this 5 days ago or 6 days ago or whatever the most recent alternative would have been, I don't think we would have had this. I don't think we would have been able to be like, yeah, like this is something that's coming. And so now I get to look smart, which I really appreciate.
Great for you. I wish you would use your clairvoyance to help us out a little bit, but nevertheless, another Good in the Room version of the Winged Wheel Podcast featuring Max Bultman of the Athletic Detroit. Folks, here to talk to you about all things Detroit Red Wings hockey, the world of the NHL, the coaching change from Lalonde to McLellan, Yzerman's press conference, and his address to Red Wings Nation, and lots more. I'm one of your hosts, Ryan Hanna.
I'm Brad Crisco.
I'm Max.
And I'm Evan.
That was good, guys. That was really good. On this episode of the Winged Wheel Podcast, we're going to talk about Yzerman's press conference and an overall discussion on the quote-unquote Yzer plan, what's happening in the rebuild, talks of expediting it, and if frustrations are boiling over in Hockeytown. We'll get into McLellan's comments, Larkin's comments, pretty much everything regarding the transition into McLellan, all the way into his first game with the Detroit Red Wings. We are recording this bright and early on Sunday morning, so one game has happened, and we'll address that. And then we'll have news on the World Juniors as it relates to the Detroit Red Wings, their prospects, and some of the massive news that's happened in the World Juniors, more from across the NHL. Before all that, two things very quickly. Hot Stove Stories Rounding the Bases with Mike Tirico and guests is on Tuesday, January 14th. Go to jamiedanielsfoundation.org to get your tickets. It's in benefit of the Jamie Daniels Foundation, an incredible initiative that we're very, very proud to support. The event doesn't just feature Mike Tirico. It also features Jason Benetti and Dan Dickerson of the Detroit Tigers, Len Casper, Dan Shulman. There's also going to be a silent auction online as well. So go to jamiedanielsfoundation.org to find out more. Get your tickets, and those silent auction items are amazing. Wait till you see what Ken has up there for you. Secondly, if you want to support the Winged Wheel Podcast, patreon.com/Winged Wheel Podcast. You get access to benefits like our bonus overtime episodes, all of our bonus content that we record right after this main episode or otherwise, our Winged Wheel Podcast Patreon exclusive Discord. Additionally, you're automatically entered into all of our giveaways. For example, we give away 2 tickets to every Detroit Red Wings home game, the vast majority going directly to our Patreon supporters. So again, patreon.com/Winged Wheel Podcast. So why don't we jump right into the Steve Yzerman press conference, because I think, overall everyone is talking about, the coaching change, but Yzerman's address to the Red Wings fans and to the media this one was interesting. And spoiler alert, Yzerman didn't reveal anything, any deep insights into what his plan is or any secret trade that he's working on or anything like that. And that's actually something else we'll talk about today is the continued Buffalo Detroit rumors. But he was a bit, I phrased it as passionate, but I felt like he got, relative to how Yzerman is in press conferences, which is usually measured, a little intense there. What were your thoughts, Max?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of kind of, I don't know if heated's the right moment, but kind of like defensive moments. There's that one. There was, one where he got asked, like, do you have the good players here? And he said, to win a cup? No, but to meet my expectations, yeah. And it's a simple enough answer. I don't think there's anything crazy about that answer, but there was, I think, a little tone of a little defensiveness at a couple times. And I think that just speaks to the frustration that I think everyone is feeling Obviously, we hear it from the fan base all the time. I'm sure you guys feel it, and I think pretty visibly, you can see that the front office feels the same way, that I don't think this has gone as fast as they would have liked or as smoothly as they would have liked either, obviously.
One thing that stood out to me was his whole conversation about, acknowledging the fans' frustrations. And I think he did that a bit more, and that was natural, right? Like, you can't, as a GM, go up there and pretend that everything is hunky-dory. And I think Yzerman did a good job of acknowledging, like, even though he has always said this is going to be slow, this season still isn't to expectations. But he did say quite a bit, again, relative to what Yzerman would say, the word expedite. And he talked about wanting to do that responsibly. He always qualified it, to say, like, he's not going to go out there and make it a dumb move. But if he can, him and his team are looking for any ways to kind of move this rebuild along. And that, to me, signaled a little bit of, like, I don't think he was trying to secretly signal, oh, I have a deal in the works with Buffalo. I think it was a kind of an olive branch to fans to say, like, it's not like we're just sitting on our hands. It's just that these deals don't come easy, and that you can't really force the issue, and he doesn't want to force the issue in a trade, so to speak. And then the natural response from questions and from fans are to say, well, the contracts are a bigger question right now. But did you sense that same kind of thing where he's, was almost speaking to the tone of, this is taking a long time, and I think you're right for being frustrated?
It could be. I mean, I have a hard time kind of getting into his head, right? Obviously, I think everybody does. When I heard that, there, some of the things I thought of were just, it's easy to underrate how hard it is to make that kind of move, right? Like, we all kind of in our heads have this idea of, yeah, so you go make a trade and you get a great player, and now boom, you got a great player. But almost everyone who's available is available for a reason. And that doesn't mean that reason means that they can't be good or won't be great. But it is a risk, right? I think back to this summer, and you guys on this show really were high on the idea of trading for Martin Necas. And I was like, there's a lot of risk with that. He's a player who has only really 1 year where he's played at the level that we're talking about for what the potential contract would be. That's a move that would scare me. Well, 4 months later, here where we are here, yeah, trade for Martin Necas in the summer looks like a great idea. It looks like something they should have done, but it looks like something that it still would have been a tremendous risk at the time, right? And I think that's true of almost any move that you could make, especially in season. Teams aren't making like moves in season with players that they have no concerns about. In general, that it's either a guy's going to go to free agency, a guy's not playing up to his contract, a guy needs a change of surroundings, a guy's whatever, had some injury trouble, we don't think we can sign him, that kind of situation. And each of those players carries layers of risk. And so you can't rush to a deal, I think, is kind of the message he was trying to send us. As much as I'm looking at all these things, or will be looking at all these things, it's not something you can rush into just to say, okay, now I've done it. And that's me talking from someone who, my column the day that they made this change was they got to do more stuff too. So I think they got to do more stuff for sure. But I think his point was, I can't be doing it just to do it. And I think that's pretty understandable.
He talked about the reasons behind letting Derek Lalonde go. And it was the expected kind of justification, which is that the team wasn't performing to an acceptable level. And that, I think, no matter what side of the coin you're on in terms of, who's at fault for this year's roster and the performance, I think you can agree that or for the most part, that the roster hasn't been performing to an acceptable level. What got my attention, though, was and I'm kind of surprised he went here, was when he said, all things going well, players playing well and players staying healthy. So this is like an ideal scenario, but he expected them to be competing for a wild card spot. And I thought about that and I said, I can see how he, is thinking that, because I think if you signed Tarasenko and Gustafsson and they were like 3/4 of what you thought they could be, not even fully what you thought they were at signing, but most of it, then yeah, I can absolutely see how this team would be competing for a wild card spot. But if your understanding is that Gustafsson and Tarasenko, for example, are just the players that they are, I don't really see a version of this team that was already getting outstanding goaltending competing for that wild card spot. So I don't know if I'm just kind of, nitpicking at that one, but I was a little bit surprised by that kind of expectation that he laid out.
I think it's a fair expectation, because even in the offseason, we talked a lot about, you could almost draw a line from the players they lost to the players they acquired. Perron's gone, bring in Tarasenko. Gosper's gone, bring in Gustafsson. Sprong's gone, Berggren's getting promoted. And then we talked about the internal growth from the young guys. Maybe a Kasper makes the team, which he has. Seider might be another year better. Edvinsson might come in and really change this decor. Raymond should be another year older and better. And in the case of Seider, Raymond, Edvinsson, Kasper, those things have all come true. If that's what we were thinking, he was obviously thinking that, and he was right. The problem is all the other external replacements he came in were not just downgrades. They have turned out to be severe downgrades. Tarasenko's a fraction of what Perron brought last year. Gustafsson to Gostisbehere, I'll be nice and just let that one slide by. And Berggren, though he hasn't looked out of place, has not brought nearly the level of offense that Daniel Sprong did. So I think going into this season, expectations for a wildcard spot were probably fair. I think we all here settled on they're not going to make it, but they'll probably be in the hunt come, mid-late March. But unfortunately, and it's been a trend, the free agency has been a disaster. And they just lost too much value there versus what they brought in to be the same team they were. If you had told me the Red Wings were where they are right now and the goaltending cratered, okay, that happens. That's goaltending. But if you told me they are where they are and the goaltending's been as good as it has been for a large chunk of the season, I'd have to tell you every other move must have been a catastrophic failure, which to this point it has.
Yeah, and I think back to our prospect profiles. And when I think back to our season preview, I think, Ryan, you might have been the highest point total with 92. So I think we're all sort of in line of where we...
What are you doing going remembering that for? You don't remember anything. Are you kidding?
Well, I think I was 91.
Go away.
I was 91. So I think I'm right in the same boat with you. Brad was in the 80s. So we're eating it a little bit this morning. But yeah, I think we're totally in line. And I remember us drawing those comparisons, like Brad said. And we're like, yeah, this team will maybe compete for the wild card again. It should be exciting if we see the same energy and sort of urgency out of this team. And I think so far this year, we've seen urgency in maybe a handful of periods, let alone games. So yeah, it totally makes sense.
Well, that word and then that line of thinking, Evan, I think is why they did it now. And I was somebody who thought you're kind of wasting your time to do it. I think my attitude going into this was, if you make this change, you're going to pay two coaches to miss the playoffs, because they'd have to play at like 105, 106 point pace at this point to get to that 92, which looks like it's going to be right about where the line is. And my attitude was, you're just going to pay two coaches to get to that same result, and the roster's still going to be the roster. Like, what's the point? Frankly, a little nihilistic. And in the 3 days since this has happened now, I think my perspective on it has turned a little bit in a couple ways. One, in a sense that, okay, it does seem like maybe the room maybe needed a pressure release. Just being in it yesterday for the first time since the switch, I do think there was a little different energy in there. Certainly there was a little bit different energy on the ice, and maybe that is a valid enough reason. Another reason, though, goes to the way Brad was talking earlier about the players who have underperformed. I think there is something to be said for, you make this change in season, you find out, okay, are they underperforming because they needed a new voice and because of coaching, or are they underperforming because that's how bad the miss was on the player, right? Like they were just done, right? A guy like Tarasenko is getting to the point in his career where the cliff's coming somewhere, and maybe you could argue there has already been kind of a first cliff, but certainly when you get into the 30s, there's always that point where, okay, I think now it's at the point where it's probably not coming back. And you're going to find out now if that's the case, or if this was, he needed a new voice, he needed a new, set of eyes on him to see, okay, where do I use him, and needed new tactics to kind of motivate, things like that. And that's the other reason that I'm kind of coming to understand the timing on this one.
And obviously the Perron to Tarasenko, Gostisbehere to Gustin, those are the easy ones to pick on, but I think the bigger assessment of the underperformers has to be made with the guys who have some term. Comfer, Sherrod. I know Hall's got a year left after this one, but if McLellan can fix any of those guys who are all dramatically underperforming this year, that's a huge, huge win in and of itself, because now you're not maybe scrambling to give away a second round pick to unload one of these guys, or you're not trying to, figure out a way, how do we hide them on the fourth line for $5 million or hide them on the third pair for $4 million, whatever it is. That alone could be worth the coaching switch for the rest of this season if you can maybe save yourself some future assets trying to unload some bad contracts because McLellan got them going again.
And Hall seems like a natural candidate for that. He's a guy who signed into this organization and from day one really got very little opportunity. Justin Hall did. Like Lalonde didn't seem to kind of, and part of that is they had too many D last year. And he was kind of boxed out a little bit, but he never seemed to get the kind of trust and opportunity from Lalonde that my guess is they envisioned when they gave him that contract. Because I don't think you're giving 3 years and $3.4 million to a guy who you see as competing for your 6th D job. So if McLellan comes in, it's a fresh set of eyes. He sees kind of what, I'm sure what the vision was when they signed him, which is this veteran guy who played top 4 minutes on a playoff team. I don't know that he can play top 4 minutes for you anymore, but I think he can give you very solid and probably more robust third pair minutes than you can get from any of the other options. He seems like the most natural candidate to see a day one elevation of his role, of his opportunity, and probably of his play.
There was a lot of confirmation that came from other comments. I'm thinking specifically about Dylan Larkin as to why this was needed. And we'll get to that in a second. But in terms of the players and kind of rehabilitating players for one reason or another, the long or the short term, I think a lot about New York, and not specifically about how the Rangers have completely imploded this season, but I think about when I talk about Lafreniere and Kakko over there, where I'm like, there's just no way 2 different lottery players who are so highly regarded failed like that, at least for Lafreniere early in his career, and Kaapo Kakko, completely maybe, if you want to call it that. Whenever I see that, I'm like, what are the chances that you just happen to have that many guys underperforming, or how much of this is organizational? And with the Red Wings, it's like, okay, yeah, we get on Kopp and Sherratt and Petrie and whatever, but, Comfort took a big dip this year. Is that just to him, ending a run hot from last season? Kane took a big dip this year. Is that just his hips and his age catching up to him? Tarasenko has been invisible at best for most of the year. Is that just father time, like Max said? There's individual justifications for all of these guys falling off, but all of them in the same season is where you have to start to think, okay, maybe there's something else here. And so if McLellan can come in and get anything out of Kane or Tarasenko or, don't kill me, Veleno, for example, and then boom, they're great for a trade. Or, you get this going for Comfort or Kopp, and then the rest of the contract doesn't hurt so much. Like, there's short and long-term benefits to this, and I don't want to say it doesn't hurt to try. Derek Lalonde lost his job, still being paid for it, as Evan is very jealous of, but still, that's a head coach who lost his job. But to quote Evan from last episode, this is the easiest lever to pull when you're trying to address those things. And I do want to repeat, I think things reached a critical mass, in multiple ways there. Pivoting over to other justification, and you guys both alluded to this, Brad and Max, like the players seemed ready for this, and that was very loud to me in Dylan Larkin's comments, where there's allusion towards the niceness of playing under someone who has experience and who's kind of been through this process of a team getting better, like McLellan has been with LA and Edmonton and what have you, and also other comments that just said, like, to me, that the room was ready for this, and this was a larger kind of want for a new voice in the room, to put it gently.
Yeah, and I don't whether that was a want or whether that's like a recognition or whatever. Like, you could probably parse that, but I do get the sense that the experience is going to be a valued thing here under McLellan, and I know people kind of can roll their eyes at that. Like, even when he was hired, I saw some comments that were like, well, this guy's already been fired from 3 different places. Like, what are you doing? And it gets at the idea that I think people like to label retread, which I hate. Like, I think it's so funny that we get angry at experience in this job when, like, we would not in any other job. It would be a good thing to have, oh, he's done this before, kind of thing. But because hockey coaches are hired to be fired, and almost nobody lasts more than 3 or 4 years anymore, it's especially, I think, crazy to think that you would be hiring a coach who has never been fired before. And if you are, you're sacrificing the experience. And I think what it brings is it just brings backing. Like, when Todd McLellan goes into that room, everyone in there knows that he has coached 1,100 games. He has coached Connor McDavid. He's coached Leon Draisaitl. He's coached Anze Kopitar. He's coached Drew Doughty. He's coached Brent Burns. Like, Joe Pavelski, I think, was still there under McLellan in San Jose. But some really good players were. I'd have to go back and look at some of these rosters. everyone in that room is going to know, okay, when he says this, it's coming from a place where he's seen this and he's seen other things too. Like he's seen a whole lot of things. And I just think that adds a lot of backing to a message. That doesn't mean I don't think you should ever hire first-time coaches. You would never get new good ideas into the league if you didn't. But I do think that's why you see the pendulum, right? Is you go from a first-time coach, the natural pivot is to go to a guy who's done this forever and has seen so many things and I can appraise this situation from probably a few different perspectives. And I asked him yesterday, McLellan, does this situation call on any of your particular experiences in particular, right? Whether it's San Jose, Edmonton, or LA. He said it's too early to know, but that's something I'm going to be really curious to maybe follow up with him on in a couple of weeks and say, okay, does this remind you of where things were at? Probably not going to be in Edmonton because there's not a Connor, there's not a Leon here. Does it remind you of where things were at in LA? I think would be a pretty fair one though, because I think that team was in a similar place where they had this like good farm system coming up. Kopitar, I think, was probably not too much older than Larkin is now when he first got there, maybe a year or two older than Larkin is now. So maybe there's a difference with Doughty. Certainly they don't have that Doughty on the back end in the veteran sense. They have Mo, who's younger, and Simon, who's a lot younger. But they did take that team and they took it into the playoffs. And I think if he can take this group into the playoffs, I know everyone's bar is Stanley Cup, but focus on the first checkpoint. I do think if you're talking about getting this group into the playoffs, having the resume that McLellan has, seeing the things that he's seen, I believe that he can get them into the playoffs. Not this year. I don't think anyone could get him into the playoffs from this point this year. But in the coming years, in his tenure, I think that should be the bar. And I think that's kind of why you make this move.
And to call it out, we on this show have been very loud in the past of, retreads, the coaching carousel and things like that. And one thing that I've learned, in my opinion, has changed over time is that, getting new blood in the coaching system is good. And you shouldn't just take, guys who have proven that they shouldn't be NHL head coaches and stick them in jobs just because it's convenient. But where my opinion has changed is that there are certainly situations where coaching experience, even if it doesn't come with the backing of cup wins, is absolutely beneficial. And it shouldn't even stop you from thinking that they could win cups. Look at Paul Maurice, who's one of the most highly regarded, coaches in the league now, but before was kind of the butt-ended jokes a lot of times to say that he wouldn't get it done. So that's something where, I have egg on my face where I used to clamor for, get as much new blood in as possible. I still think that, you look at Carl outside of the league in the NCAA system, there's great coaching that's not in the NHL that should be, but at the same time, the experience has proven to be necessary on a case-by-case scenario. And it's human, it's nuanced. Those guys aren't out on the ice with pucks and sticks. And so it is absolutely all emotional and psychological. So it's extremely hard to quantify. And if anyone comes in and says, including us in the past, this is absolutely the right way to do it and the only kind of guy who can fit on any team, it is not so simple.
Carl may have just had the biggest checkpoint on his resume last night where he leaves to go coach the World Juniors and Denver loses to a club team. So he's going to get a job someday.
He is. And he's the exact kind of guy that if I'm hiring a first-time coach, I would hire because, he has a ton of experience, right? Like he's done it in all kinds of different avenues. He's seen different things. He's coached at the NCAA in one. He's coached in the World Juniors in one. But I think there's just different kinds of it, right? And frankly, I think experiences like the one that Lalonde just had in Detroit are what are the valuable experience that will eventually make him more successful whenever he gets his next job. Because now he can say, okay, I've been in Tampa. I've seen what it looks like when a team is really good and ready to be great. And I've been in Detroit where a team is just trying to get to good. And those are two pretty important perspectives to have. He's rounding out just as anyone else is, in the earlier days of their career, all the different perspectives you need to go through that to know what to do in them. And so I think Lalonde will be better equipped in his next job too, based on what he did in Detroit.
I'm super curious how the emotional factor and the emotional level from the coaching staff is going to increase. I think there's already been some clips at practice that have gone viral in the Detroit sphere, at least. I think that will be a big thing for fans and probably for players too, because it feels like, there's been a lot of apathy lately definitely amongst fans and maybe amongst the players as well. So it'd be interesting to see what Trent Yawney and Todd McLellan can inject in terms of some fire and some emotion.
I've been wondering if I'm going to see a T-shirt tonight at the Sunday night game that says "Play f***ing hockey" on it, because that was the money quote out of the first practice that McLellan had as he was trying to get him to be less mechanical.
No, and I think obviously the experience is a huge factor with McLellan, and the more experience you have, the more gauge you can get on what type of coach he is. But I think that was probably the Red Wings' biggest thing right now was what type of coach are we getting now? Because we obviously know Derek Lalonde was a great guy. Like, I don't think anybody leaving that room or or in this fan base is going to have anything to say bad about Derek Lalonde, the person, but he was not hard ass. And the way the team was playing this year, they need a hard ass because, again, you look at just all the apathetic performances on a game-to-game, period-to-period basis from the whole team, and then you look at the, as we already talked about, long list of underperformers. Just watching McLellan in the practice going in and yelling stuff like play effing hockey and all that other stuff. That's what this team needs. And yeah, you get a short-term bump from that, and eventually that wears thin, and coaches like that generally have a shelf life. But again, circling back to what Max said earlier, if he can get them into the playoffs in the next 2 years, nobody cares. Like, his shelf life could be 2.5 years, but if that includes one playoff run, great hire.
We'll get to McLellan's comments specifically here, but one thing I want to kind of acknowledge is that I think you guys are right in saying that he's not like the Tortorella type, like hard ass. And what I really like is, one, how McLellan is very visibly vocal, and I think that's what this fan base needs. Again, I don't think it's a knock on Derek Lalonde. I think it's, different strokes kind of thing. Not everyone's going to be the same way, but McLellan is simultaneously, vocal with his team. You can see him be vocal with his team on the bench in practice, and then also vocal with the fan base in terms of what he's bringing. He's put forward as a very balanced, measured approach to that, where it looks like he's not going to just, drill the guys and yell at them. And especially with the young players, they don't want that, but he's going to try to give them what they need. And it speaks to the adaptability overall that I think profiles McLellan as a coach, which is the kind of guy who's not just going to run an ultra defensive system, even if he prioritizes a stout defense. He's not going to just run a ultra offensive system, even though he prioritizes, creativity in the offensive zone. He's going to work with what he has. And I think that's the path forward. I'm not saying that's exactly how things are going to work out. Not going to sit here and say we know the future and things are going to be perfect, but I don't see this as a, typical hard ass, this guy is going to have an expiry date for sure coach. I think tries to move with the flow. And one thing I like that he mentioned was that, there's way more players in this league than there are coaches, and the coaches have to adapt. And that is more evident today than it's ever been in the NHL.
I think it's also clear that he's not, I'm sure he will make tactical changes. That's part of becoming the new head coach of a hockey team. But I think it was pretty evident on his first day that the main messages are going to be ones that don't require the whiteboard, right? It's going to be, I think that the quote was harder, faster, and a little bit smarter. That's going to be the mantra, I think, of at least these first couple of weeks as he tries to kind of reinvigorate this. And sometimes that's simplicity, right? Go back to play effing hockey, right? You've done it your whole lives. That was the line. Sometimes the simplicity, I think, can really help players snap out of it and be that more like instinctual, have that more instinctual feel when they're on the ice.
And every player gets a fresh start too. We saw his line, I don't know if they'll stick because it was one practice, but his line combos were all over the place. And, to pick a low-hanging fruit to pick on here, but every Red Wings fan all year has been screaming about Jeff Petrie on the second pair. If Jeff Petrie continues and stays on the second pair for the rest of the season, all right, if two coaches are seeing the same thing, odds are it means there's not a better option. And, Hall isn't that guy or whoever isn't that guy. We got Joe Veleno, I think, was skating on the first line because he had a good game Friday night, which if this is the type of coach that starts rewarding players for effort, by and large, you're going to see better efforts from the whole team because they all want to get moved up the lineup. And if you keep seeing a Berggren or a Kopp or whoever down the lineup, again, two coaches seeing the same thing, it's going to give us as fans a bigger clue into what's going on in the room and how professionals are analyzing these players. Because if there's some things that are consistent Lalonde to McLellan, okay, it's probably a good indication that's the best option or the worst option. And if you see changes, well, then good for those players getting rewarded for an honest effort.
Yeah, I think for me, this is the biggest part of bringing in a new coach. You sort of get confirmation on what you've seen or have not seen this year. Is Patrick Kane going to come to life under Todd McLellan? We'll find out very shortly. I think it'll help illuminate some roster decisions in the short
Max,
and
any
long
final
term.
kind of thoughts on McLellan's press conference and, messaging to the team and the media and the fans, I should say, in his transition in as Red Wings head coach?
Well, I was just kind of struck by how quickly his message took hold within their answers, right? Like I had in my column, one of the writers asked Seider about, it seems like he wants you to play faster and smarter. And Seider was like, you forgot harder. So okay, that clearly burrowed in. Every single person who talked on day one used the word spirit. That's a word I've not heard in a hockey locker room, I don't think in 7 years. Maybe to ask, is the spirit broken or something in the really bad year, 1920? But to have 5 or 6 different people all use the word spirit, I was like, okay, well, he must have said this at some point, right? Somebody said this at some point and it got into all of their brains because now they're all saying it. And I do think that is a little bit of a sign of a message received. Okay, they're at least paying attention. It's burrowing its way into their brains, which is
more to come on the McLellan's first game with the Red Wings and the team's spirit and energy after this. But first, a word from the sponsors of the Winged Wheel podcast. This episode of the Winged Wheel podcast is proudly brought to you by Labatt Blue Light. Created in 1983, this premium light Canadian Pilsner is a delicately balanced beer brewed with Cascade hops and a blend of malt. It's fresh, crisp, and brewed to the highest quality standards. There's a little bit of Canadian kindness in every sip of Labatt Blue Light. How did it get in there? They're Canadian. That's how. You can spread the love yourself by sharing a Labatt. And when you do share a Labatt, you're not just sharing a beer. You're sharing an experience that'll pair with anything from hockey to a hoedown. So next time you're watching hockey with your buds, be sure to share Labatt because while you might not all root for the same team, although we on this podcast do hope you're rooting for Detroit, you can all enjoy a Labatt Blue Light. We honestly love going to games in Detroit and seeing Labatt being the beer that fans clamor for all over the arena. It's a reliable beer and it's great to have in your hand when celebrating a goal. So head to the link in the description of this episode or the one you see on your screen to find Labatt in stores near you today. You must be 21 or older and as always, enjoy responsibly. Welcome back. So Todd McLellan's first game as Red Wings head coach was in Detroit with the Toronto Maple Leafs in town, still without Austin Matthews, but this Toronto Maple Leafs team played substantially better this time around compared to the last time in this same month. And it was a 5-2 drubbing. But, and I know it's going to sound funny because, from 5-0 to 5-2, it wasn't a close game. But I do think there was a lot of acknowledgement from the Red Wings fan base and media and the team alike of this was still a better performance in some regard from the team. I think goaltending didn't show up from them that night with Cam Talbot getting the start and then Lyon coming in, but they showed some resilience. Those 2 goals in the third, if you count those for anything. And I do think their effort overall was better. I saw them finishing checks. I saw them getting in lanes. I saw them, playing harder, faster, smarter kind of thing. It didn't amount to anything close to a win because these roster holes are still what they are, and Toronto was fantastic. But what did you see from that game? Because I do think you saw the early starts of a transition under a new head coach.
I guess the polite way to put it would be a work in progress. The flaws were still obvious. This team cannot match up skill for skill with a team like the Leafs, even without Austin Matthews. And yeah, it's going to be the Red Wings formula. They're going to need goaltending to beat better teams this year. Even if everything goes best case scenario under Todd McLellan, they're not beating the Leafs. They're not beating the Panthers. They're not beating the Devils. They're not beating the Hurricanes without strong goaltending. So a weak performance and you get what you get. There's probably something to be said where maybe there's a touch of a confusion factor changing coaches, although I have a hard time believing McLellan would have changed all that much going into that game. But it's an awful team that looked less awful. So I will take the baby steps where we can get them at this point.
I think the bar for the last game they went out on, the St. Louis game, was pretty low. So they did clear that bar. But yeah, I think to Brad's point, it is still a matter of this is going to take some time because, again, I think the main problems were the roster. And I think it's okay to say that, guys. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be any bump from a coaching change. I think there can be. But the roster has some inherent flaws that are going to be really hard to overcome. And you saw that still. Like we were talking before the show, like imagine what would you have been thinking if you were Derek Lalonde watching that game? You're probably thinking some variation of like, see, like, and we'll see if McLellan is able to kind of find a couple buttons to push a little differently. But it does speak to the fact that I think there's going to be other things needed here besides just a voice.
It felt like such a crash course on the Detroit Red Wings for Todd McLellan. There were some brutal turnovers in the defensive zone that led to goals. I would say the goaltending was probably the opposite of what you would have expected coming into this organization. And you saw Simon Edvinsson and Moritz Seider doing their thing and Lucas Raymond scoring on the power play. Like, it felt very much like hey, if you only have 60 minutes to learn about the Red Wings, here you go.
He learned fast. Simon Edvinsson, and that's a good acknowledgement of him because he did return to the lineup. They activated him they had placed him on retroactive IR before, so he came back in. He got the Red Wings' second goal. Lucas Raymond on the power play for Detroit's first goal. Both of those, late in the game, near halfway through the third, more or less. So a 5-2 loss at home that wasn't particularly close. Up next, the Red Wings have today, again, we're recording early Sunday morning, they have the Washington Capitals at 5 p.m. at the LCA, and on New Year's Eve, they have the Pittsburgh Penguins at 8 p.m. for that game to round out 2024, and then we'll be back with you midweek. So that's McLellan's first game, and you start to see a little bit of the changes. And then we've already talked about it a little bit, but his first practice, which I think was noted, Daniela Bruce said it was officially Detroit's longest practice of the year. They were on the ice for an hour or more. And that might not seem like a lot, but in the world of the NHL where there's a lot of games in a short period of time, there's a lot of complaints about how much time you actually have to practice. So I wasn't too shocked when I heard that number, but some people were. I don't know, Max, if you think differently.
No, I mean, I saw the same comments of like an hour is the longest practice. Like, it's not the only thing they're doing at the rink, guys. Like, that's just the on ice portion here, and you can only do so much when you're going to ask these guys to go full out and have their legs, right? So, yeah, it was the longest practice of the year, and I think understandably. I mean, excluding training camp. Training camp days are longer than that, but yes, it was notable in that way.
Well, see, one thing I wanted to ask about before we jump into some more from a column you wrote, Max, is that Brad acknowledged the line juggling. And, some players are getting looks of Veleno, getting first line reps in practice, and a lot of positive comments about Veleno. And, I wonder how much of that is McLellan feeling this thing out and just seeing what he's working with, which is, I think, 80% of it. And I also wonder a little bit about, auditioning guys or propping guys stock up as we think about, a potential Buffalo trade. And another thing I just want to call out here before we dive too far into that is, McLellan has the luxury of doing this because he's a new coach with security and a mandate and a long-term contract. And he's the furthest coach in the NHL from the hot seat right now. So he can mess around with stuff. He can have a bad game result and say, well, I figured out this, and that for my players, so that's a win. Derek Lalonde was coaching for his NHL life. And so he had to pair his best players together in his mind because, every loss was just a one step closer to being fired. So that, I think, it's a thankless position and just a matter of circumstance because I don't know how anyone would have done anything differently.
I do wonder, as you say that, like, I would love to hear your guys' take on this. Like, what does he have to accomplish in the final 48 games to make sure that when they get to training camp next year, there's still that, like, the potential for that new coach energy bump kind of thing going in? Because usually that's part of the draw of making a coaching change is you're going to get that bump. They may or may not get it right now. You can argue that, like, the best thing for the big picture of the franchise is that they still finish bottom 5 in the league exactly where they are right now. If that happens, is there still going to be good energy, good buy-in, all those things going into next year is a real question for me. And I don't think that will color how he approaches like the first 2 weeks or anything as we talk about some of this juggling. But I do wonder, like, if they haven't made a big turnaround in a month, like, is that a problem? Or is that just like, no, this year's a write-off?
I almost think it's a problem if this year doesn't become a write-off for the top 5 pick that you already alluded to. I don't want to see too big of a bump because I still think they're one big piece away, probably 2. And if you can solve one of them in the top 5 of the draft, all the easier for it. And, you don't want to see it go off the rails to the point where we were talking about last episode, the rot sets in. I think this season's going to go the way it's going to go, especially when you look at their remaining schedule. It gets difficult the later they go on in the season. And I have a tough time with that, seeing them still have that new coach energy going into training camp. And this is probably going to sound a lot harsher than it's meant to be, but I think the one thing that I want to see from the remainder of this season, and more importantly, going into the training camp, is fear. I want McLellan to find out who the dead weight is on this team. I want him to evaluate that with Yzerman, and I want Yzerman to cut the dead weight. It's the NHL. You're getting paid millions of dollars, and yeah, it's hockey. It's fun. Everything's great. But you can't be comfortable in the NHL, and too many players on this awful hockey team look comfortable. And I'm not going to single anybody out. I'm sure everybody has a million guesses in their head as to who that might end up being. But again, we've alluded to how many underperformers there are on this team this year. A good chunk of them should not be in training camp next year. And if McLellan, and to a lesser extent Yzerman, can send the message, nobody's safe, that's a hell of a lot of motivation going into next training camp.
I also think, there's been a question raised by some people externally, like how in lockstep were Lalonde and Yzerman? Like, were they fully in sync on how they saw certain players? And I think with McLellan, everything we've heard about their relationship suggests that is unlikely to be the case most of the time. It sounds like they've kept in close contact even before they were talking about McLellan coming in and taking over the coaching job. So I am very curious to see if we see the roles end up looking quite a bit more like what the cap structure, I guess, looks like. For better or worse, you may agree with that or disagree with that. I don't know that people really felt like the players that Yzerman gave those contracts to that weren't playing were like the saviors or anything, speaking to like a Justin Hall or an Andrew Kopp or things like that. But I do think we may see them be a little bit more in sync in how they view players.
I think going back to your original question, Max, I think for me, maybe it leads to some quantitative data and some insights there. But for me, it's the effort and the consistency. We talked at length, numerous episodes over months, about how the team just has no consistency, period over period and game over game. And, if Todd McLellan can establish some sort of consistency, we'll see how that leads the team to shake out by the end of the season or by the trade deadline. I think for me, that has to be the biggest one, because you can't keep having games where the fans are booing you and the effort just is completely apathetic.
All right, let's transition into something that you wrote, Max, about how this can't be the only move that the Detroit Red Wings make, and it's not just a matter of coaching, because there's a lot that goes into it. So what else kind of came to mind, and what did you put out there on your excellent article at The Athletic Detroit? You actually put out a ton of work recently. We'll link it all.
All right, so I'm going to go a little bit of a winding road here on this, but in college and my first year out of college, my beat was Michigan football. I went to Michigan, and I followed that program pretty closely. And I covered the start of Jim Harbaugh's tenure at Michigan. And I did the first 3 years of it. And somewhere around year 5 or 6, it wasn't going that well. The COVID year was a disaster for them. I don't even know what their record was, but it was bad. And there was significant calls for Jim Harbaugh to be out. And I've always thought there are interesting parallels between Harbaugh and Yzerman in the sense of like, it's this franchise icon, university icon, coming back to run their alma mater, their, team, after having had significant success elsewhere. And now can they bring it home and do it there? And I think at the beginning, Michigan was in a better place to win quickly than the Red Wings were. Michigan had very quick success under Harbaugh, but it was not the kind of success people wanted. They were not beating Ohio State. They were going like 10-2, 9-3, which was way better than they were before, but it was not good enough in the estimation of many fans and media and whoever else, right? And he ended up, I think, getting his pay cut in half. Like things were not good at Michigan. And then from all the reporting, this is after I was on the beat, so I can't speak to this firsthand, but from all the reporting, just made some changes about the approaches that they were taking and what followed. And people are going to make their Connor Stallions jokes. That's fine. But I do think he also kind of revamped some things and brought in some other voices to the program, listened to the people around him in important ways, right? And you can go read all the reporting on this that like Nick Baumgartner and Austin Meek have done over the past 4 years. I think something like that, just to keep the parallel going, is what would be really helpful here for them. And some of that's going to be player personnel. We've talked about kind of the idea of a trade. Yeah, I think you got to make at least one trade. Again, not just for the sake of making it, but you got to find a player out there who's available that you're willing to kind of take that risk on and bring in and who can give a right now spark. Because I do think as much as they're going to build the bulk of this thing through the draft, I don't think you can do 100% of it through the draft. And what we're seeing with them through free agency is by definition, free agency tends to be players who are 27, 28 or older, which I think it's at the very back of what their window is basically. And it just, that the risk of that cliff is so significant in that market. So I look at the trades and I think, okay, that's where you can get 23, 24, 25-year-olds who can help you now and still be around for it. And there's that. But I also think just talking about the processes, right? And we talk about free agency and things haven't gone that well for them there. Some of that is the nature of free agency. Some of it is some unforced errors, right? And I got some pushback when I talked about this in the column of people saying, you're not being fair to the pro scout. Like, who should they have signed instead? I get that. It's a fair pushback, right? My feeling is it's not, I'm not hindsighting this and saying sign Vincent Trocheck or Dylan Strome instead of Andrew Kopp, right? I think that would be very easy to do, but I can go back and I can find my free agent target lists and all 3 of their names are on there, right? So it's not like I would have said at the time, you absolutely cannot sign or this is going to go bad. I liked the Andrew Kopp signing because I think he's the kind of player they needed. But what I think they've done in a couple of cases is they've double dipped on profiles like that have become redundant. Sign Andrew Kopp or JT Compher. You sign both of them, and now it seems like one of them is always going to be kind of marginalized, not playing the kind of role they want, not being able to kind of fully get your bang for your buck if you're playing them in a certain kind of role. Same deal with Justin Hall and Jeff Petrie. You sign one of those guys, they play on your third pair. It's a veteran guy on your third pair. Right now, you have both of them, and for a lot of their shared tenure in Detroit, one of them's been in the press box. Like, that doesn't make sense cap allocation wise, right? So I think it was fine enough with Kopp and Compher when they were your 2 and 3C most nights and to say, okay, we're paying whatever, $10.5, $11 million for our 2 and 3Cs. It's a little higher than you want, but you're willing to do it because you needed to shore up that position. So maybe that one's a little less important. But at the end of the day, I think what you have now is 2 players that fit a very similar profile. And when you have Marco Kasper there and Nate Danielson's coming, yeah, you can eventually flex both to the wing and take advantage of the ELCs. That's probably a big part of what the thinking was, is that those guys are on the way and these guys will be the kind of the placeholders. But where it ended up, and this is a little bit of hindsight because I wasn't talking like this 2 years ago, but where I think that this ended up is you ended up with a redundancy at that position, and it's a not necessarily cheap one either. And so I think you just look at, okay, what can you change about those processes? And I'm not pretending that I have all these answers, but I'm looking at, comparable situations when people who I think Steve Yzerman is a good executive. I know that it's in vogue right now to say that, oh, maybe the Tampa thing was a fluke and he stumbled into Hedman and Stamkos, but I say bullshit because he made a lot of really good moves while he was also there, right? The McDonough trade that also just happened to get them JT Miller, right? Getting Eric Chernak out of that, Ben Bishop year. The way that he materialized the Andrei Vasilevsky pick away from Detroit in that trade for I think Kyle Quincy, right? And I don't know who the player that he was trading was, but I think he kind of engineered it in a way that got him that first round pick and just kind of often knowing that Detroit like Kyle Quincy, right? So he is a good GM. He's a good executive, just in the way that Jim Harbaugh is and was a good coach 4 years ago. But you have to probably make a couple changes to how you're doing things. And I'm not saying that I know exactly what they are, but the free agent thing is maybe the most glaring thing that I can look at and say, this is an area that's really hurting them. Whether or not I can understand the moves at the time, and I would say at least probably half of them, I felt like I could. I'm not going to say that every single move they made. I think I probably wrote that Compher was a bit redundant at the time that they signed him. But there are things you can change, and that's one that stands out to me. But whatever it is, they probably need to do an internal audit and figure out what it is for them, what they can change, because I don't think it can just be the coach. I think that's way too convenient.
Just very quickly, Evan, you're out of the Winged Wheel podcast doghouse. Max, you're in it for invoking the Kyle Quincy trade. Carry on, Brad.
I was about to say, it's way too early in the morning to be thinking about the Kyle Quincy trade. So shame on you, Max.
I agree with Max here in the sense that Yzerman's not an idiot. He's made some missteps, and identifying why those mistakes were made is probably going to be the biggest challenge for this team, because you obviously don't want to repeat them. Because I think every Red Wings fan who's looking at the Yzer plan right now is somewhere along the same lines as, we got a good prospect system and our key players are locked long-term. There's all this cap that's freeing up in a couple years, and here's the blank slate. So we're all very excited about that. That's a great, great position to be in. But look at how he's filled his cap space over the years, and now the concern seeps back in. And I understand Detroit is not Tampa Bay. The no tax, the weather, people can scoff at that all they want. It's a very real thing. So in Detroit, he might have to pay an extra $1 million a year, or he might give an extra year of term to get the guy he wants. And I can't say I'm innocent here, because I've been sitting here the whole time in his tenure saying, overpay for the good players if you have to. Give them the extra year. Give them the extra $1 million. You need to get good players in here. And if that's the only way you can do it, do it. I think the fundamental problem in free agency and trades and everything that's happened in Detroit so far is way simpler than people have given it credit for. Poor talent evaluation. The theory of what Andrew Kopp was supposed to be is great. Was he ever going to be that guy at his age, at his level? Downgrading the talent around him. Was he the guy? Was Comfer the guy? Was Sherratt the guy? Was Petrie the guy? I'm wrong a lot. Ryan will tell you at length. I am wrong a lot. But the one thing I've been consistent on over the years is I have not hated, but I have argued against every one of these signings the day they were signed. Comfer, great player at the time. Too much money, too long. Kopp, good player at the time. Too much money, too long. Sherratt, same thing. Like Hall, same thing. It's a theme that happens over and over again. You can give these contracts out, but you got to be giving them to better players than this, younger players than this. Like, the NHL hockey, I should say, is the most unpredictable sport in the world. But there are some things about this game in this league that are super predictable. 29-year-olds coming off career highs and giving them 5-6 year contracts, almost universally a bad idea. Same thing with defensemen. The big, rugged, tough defenseman who plays a lot of minutes but puts up no numbers and his analytics are garbage, almost universally a terrible idea. Like, the part that irritates me about the free agency and what Max was talking about, the redundancy is a huge thing. You can stomach a couple of these because you have to fill out your roster with somebody. You can't just parade out 50% new Griffins every year. You need NHL players on this team. And if you have to overpay a couple because they're the only guys that are willing to come to Detroit that given offseason, so be it. But if you have Comfer, you didn't need Kopp. If you have Kopp, you didn't need Comfer. If you have Petrie, you didn't need Hall. If you have Hall, you didn't need Petrie, so on and so forth. It's the death by 1,000 cuts. And it's, again, I think the poor talent evaluation of it. You can go back in hindsight because it was so predictable. And yet the same mistakes kept happening over and over again.
I'm of two minds on this because, one, I'm going to repeat something I've said, it seems like every episode all year since we realized this team was going to be bad for sure this season, which is that, yeah, the free agency and the signings and the cap structure outside of the core players has been bad. But at the same time, for the stuff that matters, it's gone very well to the constraints that Yzerman's worked with. The first round picks, he's not only nailed, but Seider and Raymond, relative to the picks around them, are grand slams. Edvinsson has been an absolute home run so far. Kasper has done well. Like, the first round picks are going really well. Sandin Pellikka, my God, have we become even more excited about him. Danielson looks great. Like, that's gone well. And the contracts for the core players has gone well. So I think by the time this matters, which is what we've talked about in the past, and Brad's kind of outlined a timeline, and Max has done this in writing as well, is for the time this matters, these bad contracts shouldn't factor in. And the other side of the coin is you still have to get it right. And not only do you have to get it right later for the sake of the rebuild and, being able to move on being competitive when your core is, you have to go with them based on Larkin's age. But even for right now, it has ramifications. We saw that on the 26th, the day after Christmas, Derek Lalonde got a call saying he's fired. And was that in part due to the job he did in Detroit? Absolutely. I'm not trying to absolve him of any responsibility. But if Derek Lalonde had a better team, how much longer is his tenure in Detroit? Because losing begets losing, and losing begets a bad attitude, and bad attitude begets, not hearing the voice in the room. And it all is complicated, but it feeds into itself. And so when you put together a roster that doesn't perform, it's going to be demoralizing. It's going to be deflating. It's going to poison the well of the players who had nothing wrong with them. It's not going to bring out the best in the players who probably could have done well in the right situation. So, yeah, I mean, if the Red Wings turn this around and the Detroit Red Wings and Steve Yzerman's and the pro scouting's contracts go great in this next phase here, we're going to ignore all of this, where everyone's going to forget this very happily. Red Wings fans are just going to be happy that the team's competitive. But for right now, this phase that we just have gone through and are going through now, it's not just that the team isn't putting up points in the standings. It is actually, it has real-time effects in this moment based on, player performance development and someone's job. So it's a very complicated issue. And so I both am not screaming, oh yeah, like panic for the future, because I firmly believe you shouldn't. It's actually still looking very positive, but this does have to be fixed, to Max and Brad's points.
Right. I think the last time I was on, one of our topics was like, okay, with the rising cap, the way that they're positioned with some of their long-term deals, and they're going to have money to spend, they can go chase a star in free agency. I think part and parcel to that, though, is making sure that you feel really good about your processes to make sure that when you give out that really big contract, it's going to go how you think it is. And that's probably the most important part here, is not so much pointing and I told you so, because I don't know that how often I did tell you so. Maybe a few of them. But my point here is not to say like, hey, you should have known better on this, you should have known better on that with hindsight. My point is to say, you have to assess how things have gone and figure out if you're still comfortable making the future decisions with that exact same process, or if there's things about that process that need to change. In other words, are the mistakes something that's just inherent to free agency? Because that's an easy excuse to make, but it can be true. Is that the case, or is there something that needs to change? And I think that needs to be the next area that they're really honing in on and focusing to make sure that the right processes are in place for the next decisions, which, to Brad's point, are the more important ones. The ones that have been made have been made.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Max. And the decisions only become more critical to get right as you start to get your Axel Sandin Pellikkas in the lineup and Sebastian Costa starts to get in the lineup, because that's when, you really start the timer with a lot of these guys, quote unquote, windows. And, when the team's window is, I think John Buccigross said it best, just circling back a little bit, when he mentioned that the Red Wings have a lot of duplicates. And it couldn't have been said more succinctly. Yeah, like we already highlighted, there's a lot of guys who are doing duplicate efforts from one another. And in the short term, it's incredibly painful to watch. But to go to Ryan's point, Steve Yzerman's nailed his first round picks. The core young guys so far on the team have had great seasons. So there's a lot to be happy about looking forward. I think for us, it's easier to sort of compartmentalize those things and have that happiness potentially at some point, but for the everyday fan, they don't see it like that. They see the Red Wings lose back-to-backs to Montreal, who are supposed to be one of the worst teams in the league. They get blown out at home by Toronto, and the St. Louis game happens. Like, it's a lot tougher for them to swallow than guys like us.
So moving on, you mentioned the Toronto game, Evan, and I want to specifically ask Max about that game. Something notable about that game is that the Buffalo Sabres continued to scout the Detroit Red Wings. This time their director of pro scouting coming around. So it's not just, a regular scout mission from an Atlantic Division team. There's something going on here. We knew about it before the break. We thought a trade might come before the roster freeze. And now on the other side of things, that the roster freeze is lifted, it looks like Detroit and Buffalo are still kind of going at something. Elliot Friedman has acknowledged it multiple times. Like there's something there. And, what it might be is still, those details are still fuzzy, but everyone is kind of circling around the same names. You're looking at the Cozens, you're looking at the Byrams. Those are the two most attractive names. Maybe you get into the Peterkas, etc. But overall, in terms of a fit, and these are two bottom feeding teams in the Sabres and the Red Wings. What are your thoughts, Max, on a potential deal that would happen in the short term that would have long-term ramifications for the Red Wings?
Well, they're just such fascinating potential trade partners because it's not what you typically draw up. You typically draw up the team that's on the upswing and the team that's on the downswing. And those are the teams that make your natural trade partners. It's the team that wants to go all in for the playoffs and is willing to part with futures for the team that is, trying to kick their timeline back a few years and add draft capital. Both of these teams, I believe they're the two longest playoff droughts in the NHL, and they both desperately want to snap them. That would make for a fascinating trade because I don't think either of these teams wants to take a big step backward right now or even really next year. But both clearly also have to acknowledge that the mix that they have hasn't been good enough. So yeah, I think it would be a fascinating possibility of trade. You mentioned most of like the names that you would imagine can be in play from the Buffalo standpoint, right? It's hard for me to see them trading one of their like true stars, a Tage Thompson, a Rasmus Dahlin, even an Alex Tuck, I think would be such a devastating blow to that locker room considering what he is as a culture guy for them. So those names probably don't make sense. But if you're the Red Wings and you could steal a Dylan Cozens, or steal might be a strong word, it's probably going to cost you quite expensively. If you could go get a Dylan Cozens, I wonder, like, what does that do? Because Cozens isn't necessarily dynamic offensively. He had the one big year. I think it is interesting to go back and look at what his shooting percentage and what the on-ice shooting percentage was for him that season. That would give me a little bit of anxiety. But he's a better second-line center, a younger second-line center than what they have now, and he would fit the window perfectly. He's the same draft class as Moritz Seider. He's 1 year older than Lucas Raymond. That's very interesting. He does have the big contract, and that's like my biggest question to you guys is like for both him and Byram, who I think, Byram, obviously the threat is that he could leave in free agency fairly soon, or would they want to pay him what it would take to keep him as an RFA? There's risk to both. Byram's had the concussions and the injuries and probably he's been productive enough in a similar mold to like a Filip Hronek that his next contract is not going to be cheap for a guy who you're expecting to play on your second pair. And Cozens' contract is not horrible or anything like that, but it is $7 million for a guy who you got the 160-point season out of, but he may be more of a 50-point guy year in, year out. That's a possibility. You just don't know until you get him out of those surroundings. So go back to what we were talking about a half hour ago or whatever. Every single one of these possibilities carries risk. And which risk are you willing to take? And that's true of guys in other situations too. You asked me about Buffalo, so those are the two guys I'm going to.
Yeah, I think if you're honing in on Buffalo, the player that makes the most sense to me, if you're Detroit, is Cozens. Because we have been talking for, I think, roughly the entire existence of this podcast, who the hell is the second line center on this team? And, Cozens makes $7 million change for a bunch more years. But if he's a 25, 35 guy for most of that, especially with the way the cap's raising, that's a perfectly palatable contract. In a few years, probably a steal, depending if the cap keeps going to where people think it's going to keep going. And, if Larkin Cozens is your 1-2 and you're getting, call it 140 to 150 points out of the two of them every year, you're going to need some pretty good wingers around them. But I think that's a pretty decent starting point. It's certainly a hell of a lot better than where they're at now. And if they do luck into a Michael Misa in the draft this year, now you're staring at these 3, 1, 2, 3. I got to imagine to get Cozens, you're probably giving up one of Kasper or Danielson. But that's a whole nother argument to have if a trade does materialize. You can always flex someone to the wing. It's way easier to get a center to the wing than a wing to the center. So I like the options that provides. I did look at Cozens' shooting percentage and I have the same pause. So if he is the guy the Red Wings are targeting, I am not going to be basing my mind and my opinion off him being a 30-goal scorer. Like I said, I think 25-35 is what I have in my mind, what I think Dylan Cozens is going to be. A 60-point second-line center for $7 million. Not bad. And he's only 24, so there's 23 or 24, however old he is. There's reasonable expectation for some improvement. Getting out of Buffalo, there's reasonable expectation for some improvement. So that's the one that intrigued me. Obviously, there's a lot of value to Byram. But again, when you look at how the Red Wings are constructed, prospect pipeline, etc., I am less urgent about getting a left D than I am a center. So I think Cozens would be the guy I'd be zeroing in on if I was Detroit.
So here's what fascinates me there then, Brad, is if you could hit fast forward, what would you pay to hit fast forward on Marco Kasper or Nate Danielson's career, get him to age 23, 24, and make him a 50 to 60 point center? Because that's kind of what you're talking about then, right?
I agree. Yeah. So this all comes down to what you think they're going to be. I don't, as much as I like Marco Kasper, I don't think his offense is ever going to be what Dylan Cozens is. But how much is he's younger, he might not get paid as much. How much is that?
Way cheaper.
Exactly. But then here's the counterpoint that I have on this. So Danielson's probably the better example for this. So let's say Danielson gets to the NHL and he is what we think he is, which is probably going to be about a Dylan Cozens level performer. He gets out of his ELC and you're in that salary cap world. Is he only getting $7 million? At that point, 3-4 years from now, I got to think a 60 point second liner is probably $9.5 million. So do you get Cozens cheap now and then hope? And obviously you get with Cozens, you do get more of a sure thing. Yes, he's risky, but you know his baseline is 50 point second line center. I don't know if Marco Kasper will ever hit 50 points in the NHL. I'm skeptical on that. Danielson, again, I think he will be, but it's not a guarantee. I'd rather trade Kasper than Danielson personally, even though I really, really, really like both of them. But we talk about risk from Detroit's standpoint. That risk would be coming from Buffalo too if they're looking to get younger because they're coming into far less of a guarantee.
Also super curious on the magnitude of move. If these are the two trade partners, how big of a move they want to make. Like, are they, trying to make just a minor tweak, move around the margins? I would find that hard to believe from Buffalo, given the amount of emotion that's been coming out of that city lately. So it's hard to really know. And another guy I look at their roster, but I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense for Detroit, is a guy like Jack Quinn. Like, he just hasn't gotten his career figured out. He's been hurt quite a bit, but I've always liked the talent surrounding him. But yeah, I think for me, it all comes down to magnitude of move. Like, how big of a move are both of these teams comfortable or looking to make? There's clearly some smoke there, given the personnel that continue to be at each other's games. If something materializes, it'll be fascinating to see what it is. But, trades are hard in the NHL. But it feels like Buffalo is just itching to shake something up in their locker room.
All right. One other Red Wings note here before we move on to the world of hockey and the World Juniors is Elmer Soderblom has been playing a very physical game of late, especially this season, and I want to just call that out. We recently had Bob Kaiser on the podcast. Excellent interview pre-holiday break. Encourage you to go listen to it. And he mentioned, talking about how the team and the organization wanted Elmer Soderblom to leverage his size more. It wasn't really his style to do. He was kind of afraid of hurting guys because he was so big, and they were like, yeah, dude, you're massive. You need to use this as an element in your game in the NHL. We've seen Soderblom, mix it up with the Griffins a lot this year. We've seen him lay some big hits, and last night he got into a scrap. And I think that's something interesting to note, because for a guy who maybe on, talent and the kind of profile that he came into the Red Wings with wasn't able to stick in the lineup, if he adds this dimension to his game reliably, I can see the Red Wings being very happy with him as a depth guy in the lineup in the future, all things going well. So just a little Elmer Soderblom kind of treat there.
The physicality is key for him too, because the package on him has always been he's this 6'8" guy with skill, right? There's some skating question, but he's a 6'8" guy with skill. But in order for that to matter, you have to use the 6'8". Otherwise, you're just a guy with a skating issue with skill, and that does not have as easy of a role in the NHL. But if you use the 6'8" and you become a guy who's really physical and really skilled, now you're that unique player. And so that is an important development, to your point, Ryan.
All right. Why don't we get into the World Juniors? And there's a lot to talk about. We'll start with the Red Wings prospects and specifically getting your perspective, Max. Sandin Pellikka opened the tournament with his hat trick plus an assist. Max Plante has looked good for the state so far. Trey Augustine, not really sure. Yeah, it's the start that he wanted. And any thoughts on Kiiskinen or otherwise, but how are the Red Wings prospects in your mind faring so far?
I thought Max Plante, I thought looked pretty good in the USA game that I watched yesterday. That was also against Latvia. A Latvian team, by the way, that I am really developing a liking for. They are full of piss and vinegar. They are just really fun team to watch. They don't back down from anybody. They had chances. They had plenty of chances to make that game against USA another absolute sweater for a favorite team. So they're fun to watch. But I thought Max Plante had a nice game. I think it's interesting. They're scratching him today against Finland. Shocks me. He had a goal, obviously, but I thought he played really good in general. He had a really good back check that probably prevented a goal. A really nice couple passes that you saw. So surprised that they're sitting him down, but I continue to really like his game. Obviously, Pellikka is the big story of the tournament with the hat trick from a Red Wings perspective in the first game. He did get held off the score sheet by Kazakhstan. So let's pump the hype train just a little bit there. But in the more important of the games Sweden has played so far, he was their best player. And he obviously produced it at the level that I think Red Wings fans want to keep seeing. So he's wearing the C for them. He's going to be a storyline to watch all tournament. He's going to be a candidate for top defenseman come the end of the tournament. And all those things are really good for Detroit.
For the sake of covering the big storyline so far in the tournament, it's Latvia's upset win over Team Canada. And, again, acknowledging Canadians in this room right now, but that was a phenomenal performance by Latvia. And I know people are going to think of the previous Olympics where the Latvian goalie, just made Canada really, really, really sweat. Yes, the Latvian goalie this time around did so, but I also don't think they were Latvia was as outclassed as the shots on goal showed. I think, yes, you had a phenomenal goaltending performance, but as you said, Max, they had really excellent chances. And by some metrics, had better high-quality chances or more high-quality chances than Canada did. And, all the credit to Latvia. And I do want to talk about that team, for hours here. I think it's BS that they had a 16-hour turnaround to have to go from beating Canada in a shootout and then have to go play Team USA, who in my mind is even bigger powerhouse. That sucks for them. But to talk about Hockey Canada and the Galaxy Brain, roster they put together. We mentioned before the tournament, you leave Seneca off, you leave Misa off, you leave Yakimchuk off, you leave Perek off, you leave Kristall off, you leave and that's not even the whole list. And then you have that performance where you can't score on 8 shootout attempts and you can't score, 3 goals on 50 something shots. This is just the classic Hockey Canada Galaxy Brain. If they don't go out and dominate the rest of this tournament, this will be specifically the fault of those selections. You left so much talent off the board.
And they're not going to learn any lessons from this. I could do an entire episode, a full hour by myself, top to bottom, grassroots to top level, everything wrong with Hockey Canada. But for this tournament specifically, and I think I mentioned in our group chat, it's big 98 Nagano vibes where essentially what Canada's gone back to doing, and it didn't work for them in the past, was they build a ghost roster. These are the types of players we need in these parts of the roster. And then they don't go out looking for the best players. They look for what guy do we like the most that fits this role, rather than taking a guy who's uber talented and then just, hey, buddy, this week you got to grind a little more. You got to check a little more. We're going to play you on the penalty kill. Here's the thing about talented players. They're talented. They can do stuff like that. They're adaptable. Look at the 2002 Red Wings. Luke Robitaille is playing on your fourth line. Is he a fourth line grinder? No. Did they win the Stanley Cup? They did. Because they had the best team, the most talent, full stop. And yeah, the list of players Canada left off is shocking. If you want to get a couple guys on the roster who maybe are a little less talented, but they're just elite penalty killers, you've got room for 1 or 2 of those. It's not that you have to be completely devoid of it. Team Canada did that with their entire bottom 6 and almost their entire defense, where the focus was so much on, we got to be able to shut the other team down. They almost completely forgot, we need to score some goals. Carson Rakoff might be the most lethal goal scorer in the entire CHL this year, and they haven't even registered him yet. Like, he's there, but they haven't actually registered him for the tournament. They're not even playing him. Oh, by the way, he played for the team last year too. He's a returnee. And the coaching as well. My favorite thing I saw pointed out to me is they've got Oliver Bonk running their top power play unit. Not only does Oliver Bonk not run the top power play unit on his London Knights team, his teammate who does run that top power play is also on Team Canada. Like, the only reason Team Canada wins as much as they do is nothing to do with Hockey Canada. It's the fact that so many Canadians play hockey that even their B squad is competitive, because very rarely do they actually bring their A squad because of these moronic decisions.
Well, Canada's kind of been propped up lately by just supernova performances. Like, remember when Connor Bedard was in this tournament, he just refused to lose. So, people call for heads and, say, oh, it's like, I can't believe they made this roster decision. It's like, well, over the past, my memory doesn't go that far back. So at least over the past 6 tournaments, there's been these decisions that get made that make you scratch your head.
But what's funny is the Americans, you look at the Four Nations roster, like they do stuff like this too. What I find so interesting with Canada, to Brad's point, is like, it's not like you have to force this, right? Like, you can have your PKers and your identity guys. I think you have to, frankly. I think you have to do that. But you have 2 of them who were already first-round picks this past year in Cole Baudouin and Jet Luchenko. You can have even another 1 or 2 beyond that and still find room for Beckett Seneca, still find room for Carson Rakoff. Like, you're overthinking it that you have to go find guys who are just that. When, like, the whole advantage of being Canada or being the United States at this point, I think they're on pretty equal footing. The whole advantage of being one of those teams is that your bottom 6 guys who are those identity types are still going to be top 9, top 6 NHL players someday. So use those guys. Like, don't overthink this and bring guys who had a nice season in the queue.
It almost makes you think they're like auditioning for NHL jobs to say like, hey, I can do this. And it's so silly. I mean, it makes for a great tournament. Like the storylines are fantastic. And I think, Canadians have been spoiled by success for how long in this tournament, so that when they have these droughts, like, I think you would have to be a truly sick person to not appreciate the great hockey story that was Team Latvia, even if you are Canadian. But yeah, it feels like they just are so lost in the sauce, which happens in any organization when you're an overperformer and you succeed as much as you do. It's like you tinker with something that's not broken. And the formula it's as simple as bring your best players, man. Bring your best players, and if you have the opportunity to overwhelm the competition with talent, do it. It's like a cheat code.
I think 3 top 10 picks from last draft are not on this Canadian roster. Like, 1, okay, right? If you wanted to leave one of Parekh or Yakimchuk home because you say they're redundant, okay, I get that. Bring one of them, though. I mean, they probably should do it now that Schaefer's out, and you got to bring Seneca, in my opinion, too.
Yeah, Hockey Canada is the classic guy born into wealth who is successful because he already had $1 billion. Hockey Canada has 1 billion elite hockey players. And like I said, all these players we're talking about are great players, and they're good enough to absolutely give Canada a chance to win gold. But I was even listening to your Athletic Hockey Show where you're doing your World Junior previews, and you guys are like, yeah, it's a toss-up, Sweden, US, Canada. If Canada had brought their full A roster, it's not a debate who the favorite is. It's 1,000% Canada. And yeah, the States and Sweden would still absolutely have a chance. But the fact it's this close as to who is going to win the tournament is solely because Canada shot themselves in the foot.
Hey, Max, I want to divert just slightly. How's James Hagens looked from your perspective so far? Because the conversation about, and we'll eventually get to prospect profiles this year, conversation about who's going to go first is fairly wide open this year. So curious how you've interpreted his game so far.
I think he's been really good. I mean, he's been one of their most dangerous players. I think he scored their first goal of the tournament, but he's also, as a playmaker, like made some real amazing plays. And certainly for Red Wings fans' perspectives, he's one of the most important guys to be watching over the next 3 months, 4 months here, because if the Red Wings do pick in the top, it's going to take a top 2 pick to get him. I think him and Matthew Schaefer probably seem like that's the real horse race for first overall. So you'd have to win a lottery. I know that doesn't happen around here, but if you did, like, think about how often we've said, like, oh, Detroit could really just use like a playmaking center in the top 6. Well, that's James Hagens. So yeah, I think he's looked really good, and the playmaking, I think, has been what's jumped off the page, but he's such a good skater. He's competitive. Like, you see him getting into some of these scrums where Ryan Leonard's been, obviously Ryan Leonard often finds himself right at the net front, taking cross checks to the back and stuff. And multiple times it's been James Hagens jumping in there to stick up for him. So you really love to see that. It is really too bad that Schaefer's not going to get the full tournament, because it would have been phenomenal to see those two, A, go head to head, but B, just like which draft eligible is going to have the better tournament. And Schaefer's so young too. Like, that's the thing, is Hagens is like a late birthday. Otherwise he could have been last class. Schaefer's like could very nearly be the 2026 class. So I think that is shaping up to be a great debate. I really hope Schaefer comes back soon. But to me, like, those guys, along with, obviously Martone and Misa, I think are kind of on the periphery of it. But I think those are the two guys, Schaefer and Hagens, that are going to go wire to wire for first overall.
And to acknowledge, Schaefer is out for the rest of the tournament, collided with the net. I believe it's a broken collarbone. So he'll be back in time to play out the rest of his draft year, but he'll be out at least 4 to 6 weeks here, I think is what they said. So, all right, that's the World Juniors. We'll obviously update as things progress, especially from a Red Wings perspective and for their prospects and who they hope are their prospects in the future. We will save the rest of our NHL news for next episode. For now, let's jump into our final segment here on this episode of the Winged Wheel Podcast.
We're going to overtime.
Overtime is brought to you by our Patreon supporters, patreon.com/wingedwheelpodcast. If you want to join the Dub Club, support the show, really, really appreciate everyone who's been doing so. Again, the bonus episodes, bonus content, the Discord, the ticket giveaways to every Detroit Red Wings home game, all of that and lots more. So again, patreon.com/wingedwheelpodcast. Comments and questions from our patrons. They're Canadian, that's how, says, wouldn't it be something if Schaefer's injury was enough to hurt his draft stock to the point of him falling to the 4 to 7 overall realm of the first round? There's just no way, right?
No.
Well, I don't know. After that play, I question his on-ice awareness.
Yeah, if there's any one static thing in a hockey rink, it's the boards and the net.
All right, moving on here to our next question. Chimkim Nutgit says, I find myself wondering how much Perron and Wallman helped in the team spirit department for all our conversation about spirit today. It's hard to imagine Lalonde radically changed his approach after 2 seasons of progress, and his team started the season dead on arrival. Have a safe and happy New Year, fellas. May your water heaters be owned and reasonably priced.
The one thing I have noticed with the quote-unquote Red Wings leadership group, a lot of the stoic type, which would be the polite way of putting it. And that's not a bad thing. Like, it's not a knock on any of those guys individually, but you look around the room, Comfer, Petrie, they don't strike me as the big talkers, the energy guys. They're the strong, silent type, which is absolutely needed in a room, but too much of one thing could be a problem.
I think Perron and Fabry would be the two that I would kind of point to in that way. Like Fabry had been there for a while. I think he had earned a lot of respect and credibility in that room, and Perron was the like seasoned vet and the loud one, right? Like, I think Wallman brought a lot of energy for sure, but in this, I think he's still kind of, even though he is the age range of like the older guys, he was still kind of like young enough in his career that I think the thing that they're talking about is probably more of like I would say Perron front and center, and then maybe kind of Fabry off to the side. But I do think like the energy, like I think I talked about this with someone the other day, like, it does seem like the Red Wings could use a little more personality in their room. And it may not be like kind of the MO of kind of, what they look for kind of thing. But Wallman, it does bring personality. Like, I think you need that like kind of levity and stuff like that in a room too. I don't think you can have everyone be the exact same kind of thing. And not to say that they are all the exact same, but you know what I'm getting at. But I do think losing Perron, I think he was the vocal complement to a lot of lead by example, like leadership group types, and you grow, you adapt to your role. But I think a big part of this is authenticity, and you don't want guys who aren't naturally super vocal trying to be super vocal. I think guys see right through that. So that's a long way of saying yes.
Jay Gollum says, I heard there are many parallels from the Tigers past season to the Wings this season. What would it take for the Wings to have a comeback and make the playoffs and win as the Tigers did? For me, my immediate answer is a trade, because I don't see how you have the talent on the roster, even with young players. Like the Tigers had young players, and Max, you would know better, who came up and made a difference because they got the opportunity in the lineup and it just worked. But Detroit doesn't have that in their defensive system right now. Like, I don't think if you're calling up Wallinder and Tuomisto or these guys, it's going to make a massive difference in your NHL defense. And I think that's the biggest thing holding them back at this moment.
The narrative is that they called up the kids and they won. It's only like kind of true, right? Like Parker Meadows, I don't remember if it was coming off of injury or if it was a call up or what, but Parker Meadows came back, but he was an MLB player already. And he just kind of found his groove and took off to like a new level that I think is actually sustainable. You know, they recalled Torkelson. I don't think he had an amazing second half. Jace Young didn't have an amazing second half. Trey Sweeney was a nice added shortstop versus like a Javi Baez. But I don't think this was a situation where, the kids are just so much better and this is what it's happening. They had this amazing run with their bullpen and then they got timely hits. But it's, they managed their bullpen in a way that I don't know that you can do over a full season anyway. Like, it was kind of for 2 months or 6 weeks or whatever it was, this is what it is, maximize it, right? And they did that. I don't think there's a 1-for-1 application like that in hockey. Obviously, yeah. I mean, I think they're going to need to probably at some point call up some kids. And if Carter Mazur gets back, gets healthy, I certainly would expect to see him. I wouldn't rule out seeing a Nate Danielson or something like that toward the end of the season. I'm skeptical of how many parallels there are, and B, I'm skeptical of how much of the Tigers run was actually like quote unquote kids versus just they managed what they had in a really smart way.
Matthew Lynch says, seems like Coach McLellan wants the guys to play more naturally on the ice, which would favor creative playmaking, especially in the offensive end. I've heard you three speak on players like Seider over the years, how perhaps his play had been stifled by coaching comparatively to his debut season. Do you think this newfound freedom will be good for the Wings? And if so, which ones could you see it not being good for? Cheers. One thing I want to clarify before I throw to an answer here is that I don't think it's coaching that's stifled Mo Seider's offense. I think it's the necessity by the roster to start him in the defensive zone so often. But I get the spirit of it.
Yeah, and I wish I could remember. There's one quote that always sticks in my mind, but I want to say it was Marty St. Louis, where he was talking about D zone is structured, offensive zone is creative, right? Like, any hockey player at any decent level will tell you if the defense knows what you're doing in the offensive zone, you're not generating any offense. And we see that with the Red Wings all the time, where it's rim around the boards, low cycle, lean on you. Nothing really gets to the slot. It's just try to get the puck to the net and crash off the cycle. Obviously, Larkin's line notwithstanding on that one. But it does seem, and I like the word Max used earlier, mechanical. And I'm a big proponent of letting your skill players do cool shit in the offensive zone. Like, it's not always going to work, might lead to some turnovers, but if the benefit's a net positive, yeah, you got to free it up and play effing hockey.
Funny enough, like on the mechanical point, the example that he used when talking about that, McLellan, because that's his word, I wish I could take credit for it, was actually a defensive concept, right? It was, if you're on a guy defending and you get to a certain spot in the ice and okay, I'm supposed to hand this guy off now and get back to the middle of the ice, I will do that. He was seeing something like that where he would prefer, okay, you're on the guy, like just play hockey, just take the puck from him, finish the play. Don't worry about going back into your structure. The structure is supposed to be a guide and it gives you kind of rules for what you do. But when you're in a moment, you got to just be a hockey player, right? And I think that's kind of what he's getting at, but it certainly also applies in the ozone. But I did find that interesting because if anything, like you said, structure we think of as the D zone, even there, he wants them to be a little bit more instinctive than what he saw on day one, at least.
And last one here, and it's something we alluded to earlier in the episode, so I think it's a good question to ask to dive into, is McWink says Todd has brought up Veleno a few times in his short stint with the Wings so far. Do you think Veleno has another gear to him, and do you think he'll continue to get first-line minutes in the medium to long term? So what I said earlier, where I was wondering, is this just McLellan seeing what he has in Veleno, or is this kind of an audition of sorts?
I'm curious because I've always liked Veleno. He can skate. He transports the puck well. Got a decent bit of skill for a bottom line guy. But dude can't produce. Like, that's the part I'm curious about. He doesn't seem to have that killer instinct around the net. And not that he's devoid of playmaking, but I wouldn't call it an exceptional trait of his. Maybe playing with better guys that unlocks some of that. But as much as I really do truly like Joe Veleno, I'm super skeptical of him ever being a top 6 guy, even playing with better players.
I think what you're hoping for is that it just ignites a couple of things to think the game a little more offensively. If you've been playing kind of more of those checking kind of roles, like, let's just be real. There's a little bit more of just get the puck deep and make sure you like keep your shift at least level when you're playing that style of hockey. I think the hope would be you play him with Larkin and Raymond. And in addition to Larkin and Raymond benefiting from his puck retrievals and his pace, maybe he benefits a little bit from remembering, oh yeah, like when I have the puck in this situation, I can take an extra beat and look for a trailer, as opposed to like, I better just get this deep and go chase kind of thing, which, you know, there's always a time and place for. I am the dump and chase defender of this group here, right? But the time and place for it differs based on the situation of the game and certainly the players you're on the ice with. And I think that will be good for him to kind of be in those roles, however long it lasts. It looks like it's going to be the case tonight against Washington, but we'll see.
All right. And with that, we are going to wrap up this episode of the Winged Wheel podcast. We're going to be back with you midweek, but I believe that'll make it 2025. So folks, that's it for 2024 of the Winged Wheel podcast. Enjoy the rest of your years. Have a safe and happy New Year. We'll be with you on the other side. It will be, I believe, the evening of New Year's Day. So you're going to see a pretty beat up version of Evan Lobsinger if he survives his next 15 holiday parties that it seems like he has left. But thank you also very much for another year of tuning into the Winged Wheel podcast. Max Bultman of The Athletic Detroit on this edition of Good in the Room. To all of our sponsors of the Winged Wheel podcast, we thank you. And to our Patreon supporters, we could not do it without you. Patreon.com/Winged Wheel podcast if you want to support the show. And if you want to support, but Patreon's not for you, you can help out by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, making sure you subscribe, leave a rating, the thumbs up, tell a friend about the show. All that helps. To our name level supporters on Patreon, thank you so very much. Arjun Shankar, Edith Bartels on behalf of the Sarah Grand Foundation. Ake for THL Champ, brand new name level supporter. Welcome. Samuel Soderholm, Icon, Alexander Hansen, Ghost of OSBP, Glenn Brabham, Croner's Left Knee, Sea Lion, Matthew M. Rice, Adam Rose, Adam Suiza, Admiral Matt S. of the Cheesebag Navy, Alec, Asher Killian, Beer League Legend, Best James Bond, Carl Brutinen Analuski, Carl Provy, Citizen High Five, Clip Clop Nene, Connor Scobie, Craig Kibble, Denny's Gamer Girl, Derek Enstam, Cider, Dickens, formerly Marlon Winchester, DJ Denton, Eric Hill, Give Blood Fight Probert, Goose Looney's Drinking Club, Griffin God Creatives, Hattrick Sandin Pellikka, Hockeytown Love, Hockeytown Matt, Hassam Al Qassem, I Met Larkin Once, brand new name level supporter, welcome. Jay Gollum, Jacob Turner, James McLean, aka Jambo, brand new name level supporter, welcome James, welcome Jambo, I should say. Jeff Pridemore, John Engels, Jonathan Miller, Kalen Wood, Croner's Left Knee, Marcus, Matt Keeler, Mark Hernandez, brand new name level supporter, welcome Mark, Marty, Matt McKay, Michael Edlund, hey Hank, Mr. Kuzi, new coach, old problems, R.A., Riley Enright, Roy Donk, Ryan Britt, Scott Martin, Skeletor, Stephen Ordeleb, that's what I appreciate about you, Wallman's Elite Dancing D, Yzerman Stan, Aaron Hudson, General Andy Bohan of the Cheesebag Army, Sam Bankson, A.A. Ron, A.B., All Motor No Hands, Ann Stanislavski, Antonio Gracias, Axel Sandin Pellikka, Bellingham Massiballs, Bex, Bring a Bucket and a Mop for this wet-ass chungus, Chimkim Nutgits, Commander Ben Baird of the Cheesebag Space Force, Connor Layton and Corey Prida, Darren Fick, Datsuk Dangleberries, Deep In, Cider, Dylan Larkin, Trade Sacrifice, Eric Nance, Evan Beckner, Frank Stanley, Gene Sullivan, Grepsky, Griffey Boy, James Pridemore, Jeremiah Dobo, Jim, J.M. Rhapsody, Joey Jojo Shabadoo, Josh Yelton, Chaotic Monkey, Kevin McCracken, Quaz, Larkin's Loyal Lemming, Les Grossman's Ungodly Firestorm, Linda Hull, Lonnie Zone, Lucas Raymond, Mitch Minier, Ophelia, As Good As It Gets, Ryan M., Sam Migliaccio, Steven, that other guy, the Hodag, the Hat123, Trent Thorough, Wings fan in St. Louis, Scott, and your second favorite patron. Thank you all so very much. The better Chris goes on the screen, so we're going to go talk to him.
Thanks for tuning in to the Winged Wheel Podcast. Be sure to visit wingedwheelpodcast.com, where you'll find links to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll also find ways to support the show, like Patreon, official podcast merchandise, and more. And don't forget to follow us on X at WingWheelPod, at Ryan Hanna, WWP, at Brad Crisco, and at Hockeytown Evan, as well as Winged Wheel Podcast on Instagram.